let's see. I'll be bringing Cyber up, and maybe afterwards, guys, if we have any extra time, we can go over more questions with anybody who's available. But thank you guys for being here. Our next debate is going to be BoughtByBlood versus Cyber Deconstruction on Luke is a second century document. BoughtByBlood, are you taking the affirmative or the negation?
I'm taking the affirmative.
Cyber's on the affirmative.
And then Cyber Deconstruction is on.
Let's change this up. John's on the affirmative. Let's change it up.
Yeah. Let's just switch the debate. That's fine. I can probably argue a second century dating as well as you could argue a first. So
let's not switch it up on Coco with all
and
hey Coco, can you make us bigger so I can look into my opponent's cowboy hat?
Yeah, I was just about to say I might make you guys the two biggest screens.
Yeah, well, he's going first. There we go.
Okay,
yeah, we're gonna use. So
okay.
Before the debate starts, I want to get something really clear because I've seen this happen before. I'm going to show my cards here. Okay. So all of this is information that I've compiled. I'm not looking at ChatGPT as I'm looking at my computer. I have over 60 hours of information that I've typed down. So, yep, just wanted to lay that out.
Okay, so everyone that's here, 124 people that are here, this is going to be BoughtByBlood versus Cyber Deconstruction on Luke is a second century document. Cyber, you're taking the negation, right?
The affirmative.
Oh, the affirmative, and then BoughtByBlood is taking.
He's really trying to get you to argue from first century, man.
Sorry, and since you're taking the affirmative, Cyber, you're gonna go first with your 10-minute opener, and I'll start whenever you say your first word.
All right. John and host, thank you for the opportunity to present a case that challenges a long-standing assumption in New Testament scholarship that the Gospel of Luke was written in the first century. I contend that the Gospel of Luke, along with its companion volume Acts, was not written before 100 CE, but rather emerged in the mid-2nd century. This position is based on cumulative evidence from historical references, theological development, literary dependencies, and a broader trajectory of early Christian canon formation. Let's begin with what's perhaps the most striking. There is no definitive or unambiguous citation of the Gospel of Luke before the mid-2nd century. The Apostolic Fathers, Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, Polycarp, and the author of the Didache, while occasionally echoing languages or themes that could be found in the Synoptics, never cite the Gospel of Luke by name or demonstrate familiarity with its unique material. Contrast this with the clear, widespread use of the Gospel of Luke in the writings of Marcion, Justin Martyr, and Irenaeus, all active in the mid to late 2nd century. In fact, the earliest clear witness to the Gospel of Luke comes from Marcion of Sinope, who produced his own edited version of Luke's Gospel around 140 CE. This raises an important question. If Luke was already widely known and used by the early church by the end of the 1st century, why is Marcion the first one to cite it? This leads to our second point, the relationship between Luke and Marcion. Traditionally, scholars have claimed that Marcion used a redacted version of Luke's Gospel, removing Jewish elements to suit his theology. But this assumption has recently come under serious scrutiny. Scholars like Jason Badoon and Matthias Klinghardt have argued that Marcion's Gospel might not be the redaction of canonical Luke at all, but rather the earlier version, possibly the first form of what would later be canonized as Luke. If this is the case, then Luke, as we know it today, is a post-Marcionite response revised to counter Marcion's theological position and to reintegrate Jewish themes and continuity with the Old Testament. This places the final form of Luke sometime after 140 CE, not before. Now let's address a crucial but often overlooked detail, the identity of Theophilus, the mysterious recipient of both Luke and Acts. The traditional view holds that Theophilus was either an anonymous believer or Roman official living in the 1st century, but there is no external evidence supporting this identification, absolutely zero. What if instead Theophilus was not a 1st century figure at all? Some scholars have proposed that Theophilus is Theophilus of Antioch, a known 2nd century bishop who wrote Ad Autoglycum around 170 CE. This Theophilus was a prominent Christian intellectual and apologist known for engaging with Greco-Roman philosophy and defending Christianity in a systematic, rational manner. His era fits perfectly with the kind of polished Greek prose and apologetic tone that we find in both Luke and Acts, and lines up with post-Marcionite timeline. Theophilus of Antioch was also deeply concerned with the historical reliability of Christianity and the interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures, key themes in both Luke's and Acts. If the Gospel of Luke was written as a theological historical narrative intended to persuade or educate such a figure, it makes far more sense to place it in the mid-2nd century, during the time when such apologetic works were flourishing. In this view, Luke is not just writing a history for history's sake, he is constructing a deliberate counter-narrative to heretical movements like Marcionism and Gnosticism, and simultaneously defending the Christian faith to educate elites like Theophilus. This identification is not speculative fantasy, it is a plausible historical hypothesis that helps explain why Luke and Acts are so distinctively refined, theological, and programmatic in tone. They are not grassroots proclamations, they are structured apologetic documents aimed at a 2nd century audience. The Gospel of Luke also reflects a mature ecclesiology and theological outlook that fits much better in the 2nd century than the first. Luke promotes an image of a universal church, inclusive of Gentiles, but in continuity with Judaism, and features a strong emphasis on correct doctrine, unity, and dangers of heresy. These concerns are far more at home in the context of 2nd century debates about orthodoxy and heresy than they are in the earlier Christian periods. Moreover, Luke's gospel shows signs of anti-Marcionite theology. For example, its emphasis on Jesus' fulfillment of Jewish scriptures, its portrayal of the continuity between Israel and the church, and its strong interest in repentance and forgiveness as opposed to Marcion's radical discontinuity between the old and new. This suggests Luke was written with a particular theological agenda in response to rising challenges like Gnosticism and Marcionism. That agenda fits squarely into the world of the 2nd century, not the first. Luke explicitly claims to be drawing upon earlier written sources. We see this in Luke chapter 1, 1-4, and we can see strong literary dependence on the Gospel of Mark, as well as a hypothetical saying source, often called Q. But many scholars have pointed that Luke's redaction of Mark sometimes seems to harmonize or expand upon Markan narratives in ways that reflect theological reflection and distance in time. Even more compelling is Luke's probable dependence or dialogue with Matthew's gospel. While traditionally Matthew and Luke were seen as independent, more recent scholarship suggests Luke might have known and used Matthew. If that's true, it further pushes the date of Luke well after 100 CE, given that Matthew itself is usually dated between 80 to 100 CE. Furthermore, Luke's use of Greek is more polished and literary than that of Mark or Matthew, suggesting a more literate, Hellenized audience, again consistent with 2nd century context, especially if we identify Theophilus as a Greco-Roman intellectual, and the structure of the gospel reflects sophisticated narrative arc that requires time for theological reflection and storytelling evolution, not the immediacy we'd expect if it were written only decades after Jesus' death. Now consider the book of Acts, which is universally acknowledged to have been written by the same author as the Gospel of Luke. Acts ends abruptly with Paul under house arrest in Rome and says nothing about his unalivement or destruction of Jerusalem temple in 70 CE. Two events that are conspicuously absent if Acts were truly written in the 2nd century. But this argument from silence can be misleading. Luke doesn't write history the way modern historians do. He is constructing a theological narrative, an idealization of the apostolic age, and careful choreographed speeches, and the lack of engagement with actual 1st century controversies all suggest a literary theological agenda, not a real-time chronicle. Additionally, Acts reflects a post-Pauline Christianity in which Paul's teachings have been reconciled with those of the Jerusalem church. Again, a concern more relevant in the 2nd century when differing theological traditions were being harmonized in an interest of unity. And crucially, Acts depends on a focus on his ministry, makes no mentions of Paul's letters, not a single one. If Paul's letters were already circulating widely and being used in churches, as they were by the late 2nd century, it is astonishing that Acts would ignore them. Some plausible explanations are that Acts was written well before Paul's letters had become authoritative, that it deliberately suppresses them to present a more unified version of the early Christianity, which fits the 2nd century agenda for creating a normative history of the early church, one that downplays the very real theological tensions reflected in Paul's epistles, or most likely, they didn't exist at all. Regardless, this kind of ideological redrafting fits better in the 2nd century context, emerging canon formation, and theological consolidation. Lastly, we must ask, when does the Gospel of Luke actually appear in our canonical lists and patricistic citations? It is not until Irenaeus in the 180 CE that we have a firm attestation to the 4 Gospel canon, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as authoritative scripture. Earlier figures like Papias, writing in 140 CE, do not mention Luke at all, and the Muritan fragment, often dated to the late 2nd century, is among the earliest sources to explicitly refer to Luke as canonical. This suggests that Luke was not present at all in the earliest phases of Christianity. Instead, it clearly shows it was written after Marcion, becoming an authority, being positioned as a theological and narrative bridge between the more Jewish Matthew and the more Hellenistic John, mediating texts that only make sense in the context of 2nd century politics. In conclusion, the evidence strongly supports a 2nd century dating of the Gospel of Luke, the silence of early Christian writings, the complex relationship with Marcion, and the development of theological and ecclesiastical outlook, the literary sophistication, and the late emergence of canonical recognition all points in one direction. Luke was written not in the lifetime of eyewitnesses, but in the heat of 2nd century debates over identity, theology, and authority. And now with the identification of Theophilus as a possible 2nd century bishop, we have a compelling narrative anchor. Luke was writing to a real-known Christian leader engaged in defending the faith during one of the most formative and contested periods in church history. By recognizing Luke's 2nd century origins, we gain a clear view of how early Christianity evolved and how its fundamental texts were shaped, not just by memory, but by the needs, conflicts, convictions of later communities. By situating Luke in the 2nd century, we gain not only a more historically coherent view of how Christianity evolved and how its foundational texts were shaping not just by memory, but the needs and conflicts, convictions of later communities, but also a clearer understanding of how 2nd century Christians crafted narratives to meet these challenges for their times. Thank you.
Okay, that was perfect. You had 6 seconds left, so it's really awesome that you timed your opening statement. So now, BoughtByBlood, your opening statement is going to start. Whenever you say your first word, you get 10 minutes.
Don't start yet. So just a reminder, if you can give me a 1-minute warning, I would appreciate that.
Okay.
Jesus didn't exist. Paul didn't exist. The Gospel of Luke is 2nd century. What do all of these claims have in common? The answer is that they are all statements you will not hear by the overwhelming majority of scholars with an expertise in a relevant field associated with today's topic. This is what we call a consensus. This is not to say that no scholar makes these claims, but rather to say the ones that do are like a few single drops of rain that are desperately trying to shape a mighty river, absent from a nearly unquantifiable amount of new evidence that would need to be discovered. In the positive sense, it will not happen. It must also be noted that I do not hold the beliefs I hold or claim them to be true, and in fact, no one should purely and strictly on the basis of the positions of these academics or scholars. This is fallacious reasoning known as an appeal to authority. Rather, we hold and defend these beliefs for the same reasons and strong justifications that these scholars do. We defend these beliefs and claim them to be true based on the evidence. So the question we must ask tonight, is there evidence against the proposition that Cyber is defending, that Luke is 2nd century? The answer is undeniably yes. The defense I'll now present will be broken into 2 categories. 1, internal evidence, evidence found directly in the book of Luke and corresponding biblical books, and 2, external evidence, evidence found in extra-biblical historical sources, such as the patristics that lead to the definitive conclusion the claim Luke is 2nd century is false. Let's begin. So in Luke 1:1-4, the prologue, we see that he is addressing eyewitnesses. We see that he is addressing the most excellent Theophilus, and he says he has investigated everything carefully from the beginning. First, let's look at the internal evidence. It is noted by scholars that Luke's usage and style of Greek is not only extremely sophisticated, but also, as found in his prologue, it reflects a true historiographical introduction consistent with other non-biblical ancient historians. Raymond E. Brown says the Greek prologue is the most literary and stylistically refined in the New Testament. Bart Ehrman, a secular scholar, prologue of Luke is the most sophisticated Greek in the New Testament. Colin Heemer, Luke's writing, particularly in his prologue, demonstrates an awareness of contemporary literary standards. His Greek is among the best in the New Testament and reflects a serious historical purpose. Luke begins his account to address and inform a most excellent Theophilus. Scholars note that according to the Greek usage, it is most probable Luke is writing to a Roman official or someone of high governmental status, as we can only see the other times the phrase is used by the author is in the 2nd volume the book of Acts in reference to Roman officials Felix and Festus. This prologue is also noted to be indistinguishable stylistically from other historians that had recorded historical narratives prior. Luke Van de Wey notes, with other ancient historians, the Lucan prologue stresses the themes of inquiry, autopsy and seeing for oneself, and careful investigation informed by familiarity, a concern with the beginnings, such as seen in Thucydides. Luke in his prologue claims to be investigating eyewitnesses. Luke Van de Wey yet again says Luke's explicit reference to eyewitnesses is rare in ancient literature, and it reflects a very strong historical claim. He's not simply passing on tradition, but verifying accounts from those who were there. Let us now examine the evidence for the claim that Luke is recording truthful information from reliable eyewitness sources. But we're going to use research found in behavioral and cognitive sciences and memory recall. In the study of forensic psychology, researchers such as Alder Verige, Yehel Nari, and Bella De Paulo provide valuable insight to the patterns and distinctions between liars and truth tellers. Truth tellers are more likely to follow specific markers and criteria such as clarity and vividness, perceptual and sensory information, spatial information, temporal information such as time of day, and cognitive operation, interpretations that are concrete rather than sensory detail. While there are many accounts in Luke and Acts that perfectly align with this criteria, we will only evaluate one to preserve time for further arguments. Luke and Acts is written unanimously by the same author in the two-volume set, where Theophilus is addressed as the recipient in the prologue of each book. In Acts 27 through 28, we see what is called the shipwreck narrative. Luke Van de Wey states that the German New Testament scholar Marius Reiser, in drawing a comparison with accounts from other ancient writers like Lucian and Aurelius and Aristides, goes further and calls it the most thorough and historically accurate shipwreck account we have in ancient history. Does it fit clarity and vividness? Yes, the narrative uses clear, concrete language, such as striking a reef, how the bow stuck, how it is remaining immovable. The stern was being broken by the surf. It was the 14th night. Is there perceptual information? Yes, waves breaking, the lowering of the boat, the sound and storm of crashing waves, and even the taste and hunger of the crew as they urged to eat. Spatial information. It continues a spatial layout that is consistently, logically coherent with what it would be like to be a sailor in this time. Temporal information. Explicit temporal markers such as the 14th night, midnight, day was about to dawn, early in the morning. And then cognitive operations. The narrative reveals participants' mental states and judgments. Sailors' suspicion that they were near land. Paul's warning about danger and his encouragements to eat. As we see, Luke and Acts exhibit specific information contained in the narrative that perfectly aligns and is consistent with the primary criteria for what is expected of truth tellers in forensic psychology and memory recall in eyewitness testimony. James Smith, an experienced scholar and an experienced sailor, in The Voyage Shipwreck of St. Paul says, no sailor would have written in a style so little like that of a sailor, and no man not a sailor could have written a narrative of sea voyage so consistent in all its parts unless from actual observation. To strengthen this case further, we must take note of what is referred to as the we passages. Throughout the Gospel of Luke, the author never refers to himself as an eyewitness, but rather a believer who compiled eyewitness testimony. Yet this is not the same thing that holds true for the book of Acts. Rather, the author identifies himself in over 90 references as being an eyewitness to the events described as a companion to Paul, with 14 of them in relation to the shipwreck alone. Throughout Paul's missionary journeys, these accounts would also place him in direct contact with eyewitnesses. This is also strengthened in conjunction with the fact that the author of Luke and Acts did not include we passages in direct correlation with Jesus' ministry. Colin Hemer notes, it is inexplicable that a forger would not have utilized the we form in Luke's gospel if the intention was to enhance credibility. The natural explanation that the author was present for the events in Acts, but not for those in Jesus' ministry. Now that I have established my case for eyewitness detail, let us now briefly mention other independent lines of external evidence, the patristics, and turn our attention to Clement of Rome. Now, Clement of Rome wrote in 95 through 97 AD of the first century. He not only speaks about Paul's life, but he uses information that is uniquely found in the book of Acts and nowhere else in any of the Gospels or the writings. And he writes in 1 Clement 5:5, after he had been 7 times in chains, speaking of Paul, had been driven into exile, had been stoned, had been preached in both east and west, he won the noble renown that was the reward of his faith. He taught righteousness to the whole world, and having reached the limits of the west, he bore witness before the rulers, and thus he was set free from the world. So we see, unlike my interlocutor's statement, we do see early attestation to the book of Acts. So prior to Clement, Paul existed in the first century as a persecuted apostle of the gospel he proclaimed. The mention of specific statements in Clement's 1 are unique to the book of Acts. Frequent imprisonments in Acts 16, 21, 26, 28. The stoning in Acts 14. Preached in the East and the West. Acts details Paul's journeys from Jerusalem to Rome. Bore witness before rulers such as Felix, Festus, Agrippa, and even Caesar in Acts 24 through 28. Martyrdom, set free from the world. But wait, even as my interlocutor mentioned, Acts never records Paul's death. This is a detail missing from a very detailed account in Acts, which is a key reason that leads scholars to hold a first century dating of Luke and Acts. Consensus hold that Paul died between 64 and 67 AD, yet Acts does not mention his death. This has led many scholars to believe the reason Acts does not contain that information is because it has not happened. Lukenheimer states, Luke the historian brings to bear discipline in his writings. He should be judged by the standards of his era. He writes as one who knows Paul is alive. If the church had known of his death, the record would reflect it. There are monumental amounts of details that I would have desired to go over further subjects with the patristic, synoptic arguments, onomastic data points, but time is of the essence, and I believe my argument has been made clear based off of the observations we have seen. That in the Greek prologue of Luke, it matches formal historiographical standards. The earliest external sources that we see are going to be 1 Clement in 95 AD, which means Acts and Luke have to precede the writings of Clement.
1 minute.
Luke and Acts display immense eyewitness detail that is consistent with what we see in forensic modern research of truthful eyewitness testimony based on memory recall, not on fabrication. Since Acts is the second volume written by the same author as Luke, clearly establishing Acts was composed in the first century, logically implying Luke was prior to Acts in the first century. Therefore, the best explanation for the convergence of this literary, historical, psychological, and patristic data is that Luke and Acts was written in the first century by a companion of Paul. Any alternative explanation for a second century authorship would have to artificially explain away all of the above data using positive evidence while attempting to maintain historical precedent. The necessary auxiliary hypotheses you have to make in order to defend this view fundamentally make it less parsimonious and less evidence-based conclusion. Let me leave the audience with this question. If this level of vivid detail, coherence, independent, external attestation, historical realism found in Luke and Acts does not reflect the work of someone accessing authentic eyewitness memory and giving an accurate account of historical events, then what would? If we were to apply the same radical skepticism.
Mr. Or would you be okay with him finishing his last sentence, or what do you want, Cyber?
It's up to you.
He can finish his paragraph if he wants. I'll let him finish.
Okay. If we were to apply the same radical skepticism as my interlocutor, we would lose any ability to distinguish truth from fiction, history from fantasy. Luke is first century, and the prosecution rests.
Okay. With that, that will conclude the opening statements. Now, the format is going to get a little bit weird here, but I think you guys agreed to it. Cyber, you're going to get 5. BoughtByBlood, you're going to get 10. And then Cyber, you're going to finish your last 5. You guys are okay with that?
That's good.
Okay. And Cyber, you can start. I'll start the timer whenever you say your first word.
Yeah, so the first question that I have is I didn't mention or say anything about Clement of Rome talking about Paul. I mentioned that Clement of Rome doesn't talk about Luke. So my question is, do we have any evidence from anybody before Justin Martyr mentioning the book of Luke as a gospel?
Yeah. So Clement of Rome mentioning Paul is directly tied to Luke because in the book of Acts, if Acts is written by Luke, right, then the logic is just going to follow that Clement is getting his information that is unique to Acts about Paul's life. So it's not that he's just referencing Paul, it's that he's referencing the material that is based on Paul's life.
All right, do we have any early Christians in the first century that make any connection to Luke and Paul?
Clement of Rome, like I just stated. So Clement of Rome would be the first century because he writes within 95 AD. Yeah.
Does he ever mention Luke though, or are you just drawing the conclusion?
So yes, he does not mention Luke by name.
So it's
So
fair
we
to say
we have no sources. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's fair to say then that the idea that Luke and Paul were connected is just based off a theological belief, correct? Up until the mid-2nd century.
Yeah, so I don't think theology has anything to do with it because there's no theological claim implicit within the mention of saying Luke is a companion of Paul. Theological claim is going to have to do with the theology of Christianity, not the historicity of whether or not
That's true. That's true. Let me restate. Yeah. So, is there any early church history before the mid-2nd century that would place Luke and Paul together?
Yes. So we have testimony from multiple sources that are going to evaluate specifically the. Well, actually, let me say this. No, we don't, because you're asking whether or not it places them directly together in the same narrative. So the answer is no.
Okay.
We have references to Paul individually, but not Luke.
Are you aware that the Gospel of Luke and Acts utilize parts of Josephus?
So I have heard the claim, and it makes no sense. So yes, I am aware.
Okay. Do you accept that Mark? Are you a believer in Markan authority or?
Yes, I have Mark and priority.
Mark
yes.
Priority. So if Mark was written first, and then we do have some connections with Josephus, and I'll probably go over those in my next line of questioning, where Josephus wrote Antiquities of the Jews around 93 to 94 CE. We see some parallels. For example, they both talk about Thaddeus and Judas the Galilean. However, Acts, Luke gets it wrong. He reverses them when he's talking about Acts. And I think this would just be an issue. But we do have some issues, and I just feel that these mistakes and the fact that we see a clear distinction of using Josephus pushes Luke solidly into the 2nd century.
Was there a question?
Oh, sorry, I was just making a comment. I apologize.
No, you're good.
Sorry, I lost my form here. Here we go.
No, you're good.
No, you're good.
Stop his time. Stop his time while he finds it.
No, I'm good. I got it. What's your view on Luke using the other Gospels, given that the other Gospels are pushed later into the 1st century?
Yeah, so my view is that Luke is predominantly using Mark, that there's very little things that are going to be represented that he's using in Matthew. But if he is using them in Matthew, then my position is going to be that they're just examining the same eyewitness testimony and being able to evaluate that, because I hold the traditional authorship.
All right. And then how do you account for Theophilus? Again, we have Luke being written, as you acknowledge, we both acknowledge, Luke is written in a more sophisticated Greek that shows not only literary development that would take, the 2nd century accounts for, but again, we have this Theophilus who is mentioned as the most excellent Theophilus, which seems to point that it's a person of stature. And we do have Theophilus of Antioch in the mid-2nd century. How do you account for this?
Yeah, so the Greek there is extremely specific when it uses most excellent, and it is specifically related to governmental authority or Roman authority that is utilized also in the book of Acts. Now, here's the important part. That term is used uniquely in the 1st century.
Finish your last sentence.
We never use it in the 2nd century, and it is never used for any church leadership.
Wait, you said it's... Oh, go ahead.
Well, with that, we do have to move on.
He can ask me one more question if he wants. I'm okay with it. Go ahead.
Yeah, my next question was just going to be that if it is the case that Luke was written in the 2nd century, wouldn't that be evidence that we do see this term being utilized in the 2nd century?
If Luke was written in 2nd century, then yeah, that would be analytically true. If Luke is written in the 2nd century, then we would have a 2nd century reference, but that's what I'm contesting today.
Okay. I'm done for my first round.
Yep, we'll have to stop it there. BoughtByBlood, you're going to get your 10 minutes, and then we'll go back to cyber deconstruction for the 5. We'll start whenever you say your first word.
Okay. What positive evidence do you have that Luke was written in the 2nd century? Not evidence that is denying evidence presented in a positive sense, but positive evidence is going to be that which makes a positive case for this.
Yeah, I would just say that when we take like there's a bunch of examples where it's clear that Luke was relying on Josephus. And so if it is the case that if Luke was relying on Josephus and Mark, and along with Matthew, these are written in the later first century, especially Josephus being written possibly as late as at the turn of the century, I would say this is evidence for it being written in the second century.
Okay, so your positive evidence is going to be, just let me restate, that Luke is utilizing Josephus.
Correct. Well, and the other synoptics.
What data point within this model could not be explained by Luke using a common source with Josephus?
Ask the question one more time.
What data point within your theory could not be explained simply by Luke and Josephus using a common Roman source?
Can you restate? I'm not understanding the question. I apologize.
Okay. Yeah. So let me say it this way. So if there's a third source that Josephus is relying on for his information, and there's a third source that Luke is relying off there for information, why is it the case that your theory does not allow for that third source to be a possibility to get the exact same data points?
I would say that the issue would be is that Josephus and on many of these points, Josephus and Acts, or Luke and Acts disagree with a few things. And then when we look and we model Josephus with some other things, it seems that Josephus gets it correct, which seems to imply that Acts or Luke misread Josephus or had a misunderstanding of Josephus.
Okay. Do you also recognize that the reliance on saying that the material in Luke is caused by Josephus, that is fallacious reasoning known as a correlation causation fallacy?
I would say that there are too many connections. There are way too many connections. So to have this many correlation causation fallacies just doesn't make sense. We have way too much. We've got, Thaddeus and Judas the Galilean. We have the Quirinius census. We've got Herod Agrippa's unalivement being mentioned. Just too many connections to have it be that simple.
Well, so you would recognize that all of those connections, though, are going to be historical Roman accounts having to do with very prominent figures within ancient Israel. Would you agree?
Yes.
So why would you not expect...
Yes and no. Yes and no. But yeah, for the most part, yes.
So why would you not expect that to be common knowledge that could be corroborated by a third source that is being utilized by both Josephus and Luke?
Because, again, the issue that we run into is that if you hold to Markan priority and that Matthew is being used, these are held to be also written much later than Luke and Acts was written. Again, Acts ends with Paul under house arrest. He's not unalived. And so with Paul still being alive in the 60s, it would just go that they were using other sources to include Josephus, which pushes it to that later date.
All right. What is your primary argument based off of a scholarly position that you're utilizing for positive evidence for your claim?
Based off of a scholarly position, So again, I'm going to do a harken back to my friend Christ Before Jesus, Jaron. So we do have a peer-reviewed data science that has been used called stilometry, and when we use stilometry on Luke, we do see that it matches minus probably 3 chapters in the beginning, 3 chapters at the end. But it appears to be that Luke matches up with Evangeline, which was written by Marcion. So we have stilometry, which is peer-reviewed. And again, Jason Badoon, and there's been some other data scientists who have taken a look at this, and they've also been like, hey, there's a good chance Luke is written in the 2nd century based on word usage.
Are you familiar that Christ Before Jesus has been evaluated by 2 independent scholars that are neither Christian nor just purely secular, but both mythicists, that have actually evaluated the content of their material regarding stylometric analysis?
Correct. The one that you're probably going to refer to is Richard Carrier. If you go back and read his statement, he makes it clear that he hasn't read the book. He assumes in his writing that Jaron utilized the KJV version when he is doing his translations. Also, neither of these scholars state that Jaron's findings are wrong. They don't make that claim. In fact, both of them state that at least Richard Carrier. Richard Carrier at least says, no, his conclusion's correct. Richard Carrier agrees with his conclusion. He just doesn't agree the fact that Jaron is not a scholar himself, and he disagrees with Jaron not being a scholar. But again, Richard Carrier makes it very clear in his critique of it that he has not read Christ Before Jesus, and he hasn't read the Stylometry himself.
Okay, so are you also familiar that in his paper, he references 2 other stylometric analysis studies that are actually evaluating the exact same materials, to which he validates one with high praise. The second one, he says, is poorly done. And I'm going to be nice because I know they're your friends, but I will read just an excerpt quote that he says in reference to the claim you made that he said they're not wrong. So the quote from Richard Carrier is, its authors do not appear to have any relevant credentials to make the claims. The book has no academic quality. It is written like pop market gee whiz with minimal footnotes or legitimately formulated procedures. It states formulas but never shows or samples raw inputs when they give them. And then I'll go down. There's simply nothing we can check. So I have to conclude these authors, and this is Carrier, are either wildly naive, have no actual idea what they're doing, or they're trying to pretend they do, and this is a con for sales. And though my suspicions lean toward the latter, it doesn't matter because the results are garbage either way. So let's just focus on that ending claim, that the results themselves are garbage. Why do you think that is entailed that they're not incorrect in their assessments?
Yeah, because based on that statement, so real quick, in order to address this, we have to address how this shows that he hasn't actually read the book. So in the book, we have a whole chapter dedicated to how to do it, right? In the book, he shows the math formula, distance formula that they use, and they break down exactly how to do it. And in fact, he does give the data. He does give the tables with their findings, right? So the issue is that Richard Carrier clearly hasn't read the book. And that's the issue. He hasn't read the book. He's just going out making claims because it is the case that Jaron, self-admittedly, Jaron will never claim that he's a scholar. In fact, Christ Before Jesus is currently going over through 6 peer-reviewed processes right now that were really pushed by one of the co-authors, not by Jaron. Jaron has never claimed to be a scholar. He's never claimed to aspire to be a scholar.
I'm gonna interject just to maintain my time. That's okay. How much time do I have, Coco? Please.
Checking right now, you have 1 minute and 24 seconds.
Okay, so yeah, let me just move down to this then. So regardless of the stylometric analysis, let's do you acknowledge that if your dating is wrong and fails to be corroborated by scholars post peer review and Luke was written before 70 CE, then your entire theory about Marcionite origins collapses?
But there are scholars who support Marcionite theology.
Yeah, I'm talking more of a consensus. Do you agree that in reference, if your dating is wrong, then Marcionite origin collapses?
Oh yeah, if it turns out that the dating is wrong, correct. But so far, I haven't seen any evidence of that.
Okay, so if your model requires us to deny unanimous voice of early Christian history, dismiss all internal literary evidence, rely on non-expert stylometric speculation, is it really the most reasonable or most parsimonious view? That's the first question, and then the second question, and then I'll end. If the only way to date Luke into the 2nd century is to rewrite the entire historical and literary landscape, pushing all the church fathers further and further and further in time, doesn't that tell us more about your theory than about Luke?
So on to the first one, I would say no. Scholarly consensus, while it's nice, it's not about like what the scholars themselves say. It's about the evidence that they present. And it seems to be that the evidence that the scholars look at is the exact same evidence. So it'd be like me having this monster can and having a bunch of scholars look at this one monster can and then draw a conclusion that, yeah, that's a monster can. But again, the narrative that they look at comes from the church itself. It is a history from the church, mainly Eusebius, who was a known liar. So yeah, I don't give credence to just the consensus.
Okay.
So really quick. So I gave you a last question at the end there. Could you just address that question regarding parsimony? So where I asked, is it really the most parsimonious view or the simplest view?
Yeah, I would say with all the data that I have seen, I would say that what is most parsimonious is that when Luke was being written, it was being written in the mid-2nd century to fit a theological narrative, to correct a theological narrative that was caused by the epistles of Paul. And they're trying to fix it by looking back in history and crafting a narrative based on the past. So I would say it is most parsimonious.
All right. And will that be it?
No, he has another 5 minutes.
Oh,
It.
Oh yeah, I know about that. He's gonna
okay. I thought you said that'll be it. I'm like, no, he gets more time to ask me questions.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And so yeah, well, we are gonna do your 5-minute cross-examination, Cyber, and I'll start it whenever you say your first word.
All right. Sorry, I looked up something else while we were doing some other things. So yeah, so my question is, do you believe that when do you believe that Josephus was written, when he wrote Antiquities?
I hold to the original dating. So it's somewhere around one. I have it in my notes if you allow me to look. If you just want to tell me.
Usually between 93 up to 100 CE. It's dated usually within there.
Yeah. So.
All right. And do you believe that Acts was written before Josephus?
Yes.
And you are aware that Acts and Antiquities both mention, again, Thaddeus and Judas the Galilean, correct?
Yes, I am aware.
And in what order do you think Josephus lists them?
So I believe he lists Theudas first and he lists Judas first and then Theudas second. And then Luke does it in the reverse order. Correct?
Correct. Yeah, Luke mixes them up. Now, if not from Josephus, where do you think Luke got these specific names from?
Yeah, so it could just be a common source, and it could be relevant information at that ancient period in time having to do with like these potential revolt leaders.
All right. And do you agree that Luke and Josephus both reference the census of Quirinius?
Yes.
And when does Josephus say that happened?
He says it happened in the very beginning of the 1st century, and Luke puts it somewhere around 6 CE.
Correct. Yeah, they both kind of place it at 6 CE. But when does Matthew place the birth of Jesus?
Matthew places the birth of Jesus around the time of Herod.
Right. And when did Herod pass away?
Herod passed away in about 4 BCE is the normal dating.
Yeah, so how big of a gap does that put between Matthew and Luke?
Yeah, so it would put a gap, but I have no reason to believe that just because Luke and Josephus contradict each other, that Luke is the one at fault over Josephus. Because I can also recognize that Josephus himself has a lack of historical details, and he gets some things wrong in his own writings. So I don't think that that marks which historian we should prefer over the other.
Well, so this is where the issue I was coming up with. Are you familiar with Tacitus?
I am.
Tacitus writes extensively about Quirinius, writes extensively about him. So we know exactly what Quirinius was doing at 4 CE. We know what he was doing. And so Tacitus also agrees with Josephus that Quirinius took over as governor in Syria, which Judea fell under, in 6 CE. So the question is, we have a 10-year gap between Matthew and Luke with the birth story of Jesus. Which one of the Gospels are we to believe with this?
Yeah, so my position is it's completely fine if Luke makes a good faith error, considering the amount of information that would have been available at the time compared to a modern time where we have, cell phones and we have news reports and all these things. These guys, they had pen, they had parchment, they had oral tradition, and so information was not as preserved back then as well as the modern century. But if it's the case that Luke and Matthew contradict each other, or that Luke and Josephus contradict each other, it actually doesn't put any effect on whether or not Luke is a second century document, because contradictions could exist and Luke can still be first century and just contain those contradictions.
But the issue that you're relying on, that you've relied on quite a bit, was the eyewitnesses that Luke went through, these eyewitnesses that Luke saw. But if Luke is getting this information from eyewitnesses, people who supposedly knew Jesus, were intimate with Jesus, then you would think that these eyewitnesses would get it right, because there'd be more of them stating that, hey, this birth actually happened in 6. But we have a clear departure from this. So would this punch holes in your eyewitness account?
So I don't think it punches holes in the eyewitness account, especially in reference to all of the other data. So if we say, would you agree? Well, it's not my time to ask questions, but I'll say it this way. We know that Luke gets so much right regarding times and eras of people who are ruling, such as Licinius, such as... okay. We know Luke gets so much right that if Luke gets one thing wrong, it's going to put him in line with every other ancient historian that got stuff wrong. And so errors are not problematic for the view of whether or not Luke is first century. And comparatively with the rest of the evidence, no. The preponderance of evidence for eyewitness testimony greatly exceeds that of a few fringe examples.
So real quick, we have this Licinius as a tetrarch of...
we do have to move on.
I'll let him ask one last question.
Okay, but yeah, go ahead.
Yep.
Yeah, so my date is, we have Licinius, the tetrarch of Abilene, being mentioned. Do you know the historical date that we have for Licinius actually existing? They found a stone. I'm not talking about that stone. I'm talking about the actual recording of when Licinius, the tetrarch of Abilene, when he actually existed.
Yeah, so it would have been mid-1st century BCE.
No, the one that is dated survived to 40 to 36 BC. The reason why...
that's why I said BCE, not CE, BCE.
Oh, yeah. Got it. Yeah, but the issue is that he is mentioning that this Licinius is, again, Luke, is reigning during the 15th year of Tiberius. Mm-hmm. That's an issue, because Tiberius was ruling much later, right? Was ruling during the time of the New Testament. And these are reasons why I don't believe that Luke can historically be relied upon, because he gets so many dates wrong, especially since he got these from eyewitnesses.
Would you allow me to address that, Cyber?
I have no problem with it if Coco will allow it.
Coco, can I address that final point?
Yeah.
So actually, the Licinius inscription, it corroborates Luke's dating and tells us that there is a younger Licinius. So there's something known as the stone at Abilene, which you referenced, and it has a phrase on there, "to the Lords Augusti." Now, the archaeologists that uncovered this realized it's not talking about a single individual. It's not talking about only Tiberius. So here's the key factor of this. The Lords Augusti could only have existed at one point in time, and that is when Tiberius and his mother, Livia, I believe her name is, Livia existed simultaneously, because they would be the Lords Augusti. And so where Luke places this younger Licinius is directly in line with the archaeological record.
Oh, okay. Will that be it? And we can go on to our closing statements.
Who goes first on closing?
It'll be me and then you. Unless you want to go first. I have no problem with you going first if you want to, since I just got done speaking.
Yeah. You can go ahead and go. It's fine. I had 10 minutes of talking straight, so.
Yeah, no, not a problem. So yeah, just going back. Let me get this brought up here real quick. Yeah, so going back, I would just say again, when we take a look at the Marcionite hypothesis, when we take a look at that, none of the early church fathers actually mention that Luke is being written in the first century. We have no mentions of that. The only mentions that we have of Luke definitively is in the mid-second century. Now, it is the case that John did go on and start talking a lot about Paul. My argument wasn't about Paul, right? My issues, because if Paul was written, he wasn't written by the author of Luke. It could be the case that Paul did exist at a much later date, but that Luke, who supposedly traveled with him, according to church history, again, there's no history of this outside of the church, only in church history, that places Luke with Paul. And I'm a firm stander that because we have these lack of mentions in the early church in the first century, we don't hear anything till after Marcion. It seems that Luke is a response to Marcion. Luke does mention some things that John did not mention. During the second century, Marcionism and Gnosticism were real problems during the second century. These weren't issues in the first century. And these are things that Luke directly contends with. Again, Theophilus, we have Theophilus. No Theophilus would be mentioned that would be of any significance except for Theophilus of Antioch in the mid-second century. Again, this goes with the polished Greek that's being used. With the polished Greek, it shows a more literate Greek literacy culture than we have in the first century. Again, we have issues where Acts specifically seems to kind of go against some of the theological issues that we have with the Pauline letters, which seems to show that Acts was written afterwards and trying to give a more unified church narrative versus what the Pauline letters were. The book of Acts doesn't even mention Paul's letters at all, don't mention them at all. And I find it weird that we don't mention these letters that are all over the place at this time, when Acts is supposedly written while after the fact, after Paul has written these. Again, it seems to me that Luke needed to rely on sources coming from not only the other synoptic gospels being Mark and Matthew, which John stated were both written first, but it also seems that he utilized Josephus and used that quite a bit. Again, we don't get any mention of any of the Gospels themselves in any meaningful matter until the 180s by Irenaeus, when he actually gives them a name. We have other early figures, Papias, again, the Muratorian fragment, or sorry, not the Muratorian fragment, Papias, who's often quoted, but he doesn't mention Luke. But he does give a loose commentary about Mark and Matthew, but nothing about Luke. So again, this to me all shows, with Theophilus and Josephus, just shows a strong argument that Luke was in fact written in the mid-second century, not in the first century. Again, nothing historical mentions him. We have no writings about him. The only arguments that we have come from the church itself. There's no outside historians that talk about Luke, mention Luke. And it seems to be that when we take a look at all things considered, Luke did not rely on eyewitnesses at all. We've got too many inconsistencies where Luke gets things historically wrong. It seems to be that he was relying on other sources, as he states in Luke chapter 1:1-4, where he's collecting sources. And with that, Luke is written in the mid-second century.
And are you ending there?
Yeah.
Cool. And you had 27 seconds left on the clock. Now, Bought by Blood, you're going to get your 5-minute closer, and it starts whenever you say your first word.
The claim being made by my interlocutor, predominantly, and the foundation of his argument, is going to be that Marcion's gospel came first, and then Luke came later as a response to Marcion's gospel. If the inverse is true, then that means my opponent's position fails. If my opponent's position is that because of this dating, that now we have to push all of these other historical figures, these patristics, further and further and further into the future, because it is problematic if they are writing these things within early 2nd century or late 1st century, then that's going to present a problem. So let's look actually at the words of Irenaeus in 180 AD. So this is while Marcion is actually seen to be still alive, and here's what it says. Marcion mutilates the gospel according to Luke, removing all that is written concerning the Lord's generation and many of the words of the Lord in which he clearly confesses the creator of the universe as his father. We also see it represented in other church fathers, in Tertullian, where he says against Marcion, Marcion expressly denying that Christ was born made away with all his nativity, removing everything that was written on the subject in the Gospel of Luke. Now, these accounts that I'm presenting, and then another account actually says that Marcion took a knife to the Gospel of Luke. Positive evidence is going to be what we have actual documentation for, what we have actual tradition for. That is going to be positive evidence for a claim. Now, positive evidence is not within my position, my opponent's position. He's not presenting positive evidence. He's denying the evidence that we already have, pushing the dates further and pushing these other sort of hypotheses that are going to say that, well, no, it's the other way around. Luke is borrowing from Marcion. But the positive evidence states that Marcion mutilates the gospel of Luke, not the other way around. And that's just 40 years after the fact when we look at Irenaeus in 180 in his book Against Heresies. Something we also notice, that if Luke and Acts are written in the 2nd century, why is it the case that they do not reference other heresies that are prevalent in the 2nd century? Irenaeus is already attacking in Against Heresies certain doctrines, including Marcion having to say that he stripped the Gospel of Luke and just took what he wanted and left the rest. But that doesn't seem to be the case, because in Luke and Acts, we don't see a challenge to later heresies. We don't see a challenge to heresies such as Arianism or anything like that. We do not see challenges in any sense to these like later 2nd century heresies. Now, this is really good, yet again, positive evidence for the claim that Luke and Acts are not writing in 2nd century, because there are no challenges to these other heresies. They start predominantly with Irenaeus. And like I said, the positive evidence states that Marcion mutilated Luke, not the other way around. Now, when I asked the question to my opponent, hey, what's the most parsimonious view? This is the key. Parsimony requires simplicity. So you have these two things. You have a hypothesis. So there's two hypotheses. Let's say Luke is 2nd century or Luke is 1st century. And then we say, what is best explained? What gives the most explanatory power? And what is the simplest explanation? My explanation only requires these assumptions. It's going to be that Luke is an eyewitness. He is recording as a companion of Paul. He is including the we passage. Did you say a minute, Coco? Yeah. Okay. He's including the we passages where he puts himself directly in the narrative of Acts, but he's also writing Luke prior to Acts, and there is no such thing as the we passage. So why would he not include that he is an eyewitness to the very ministry of Jesus, but would include that he's an eyewitness in the to the missionary journeys of Paul? It makes no sense if you're trying to fabricate something and provide validity. So these two hypotheses, 1st century, 2nd century, guess what? I only need that Luke is an eyewitness, he's historically recording detail, and he's a companion of Paul that is writing prior to all of these later heresies, prior to Marcion in the 1st century, to give Theophilus, which again, most excellent, is only going to be attributed, it's never going to be attributed toward a bishop. He's giving that. But on the other side, the assumptions that my interlocutor has to make in order to preserve a second century dating. Say what?
Finish your last sentence.
Okay. The assumptions my interlocutor has to make do not promote simplicity, but rather they are the denial of all of the historical data that is supported by scholars and supported by the tradition.
Bet. And that will be the conclusion of the debate. Thank you, guys. I'm looking at the time. We're doing pretty okay. We've got about...
and you know what, John? Air high five.
Absolutely.
We've got about 18 minutes before...
I really enjoyed this. So
Yeah.
I did not enjoy prepping for it. I will never do a debate again. I hate formal debates. I'll just come up on your live one day and we'll go over all of the other... I've only used maybe 5 hours of notes in the 60 that I prepped for. So I'm just going to bring this whole document to your live stream and we're going to talk for a really long time. Okay?
Yeah. And yeah, we've got 17 minutes until the next debate. So we'll start doing questions. And then
Do we have the poll up?
John, holy smokes, man. I mean, golly, brother. Golly, that's impressive, man. John, my question for you is, what did he say he was going to do to you before this debate that prompted this debate to occur? What did he say? Could you remind me real quick? That's my question to you.
So I will give the context. What prompted this debate was I received information that Cyber had put, and me and him had never talked before, okay? We had no interaction. I'm just like another apologist on TikTok. And so what he said was he was going to be petty, body, and embarrass me in the debate. That was the exact...
That's what I remember. So my question to Cyber is...
Well, really quick,
Cyber,
let me say, before you finish, I just wanted to clarify something. We have talked since then, and he apologized for that. I apologize for challenging him to a debate and causing this drama to begin with. So me and Cyber are completely cool.
Yeah, I'm just curious. So Cyber, after that, do you recognize that you failed to body and embarrass him? And
He was absolutely bodied. I'm kidding, John.
Yeah. So, yeah, that was John. Great work. Great job representing Christ. I guess, my favorite part of this conversation was Cyber saying out loud verbatim on record that Paul may have existed. That's amazing. Great job, John.
Amen. I must have missed that part, but glad someone in the audience caught it.
Oh, yeah, that wasn't the argument. Real quick, while we're waiting, just some points of clarity. So Marcion passed away in 160. So he passed away before Irenaeus wrote his heresies against Marcion.
Oh, okay. I might have got that wrong. There is someone who challenges Marcion while he's still alive. I think I might have. It's not Irenaeus. It's someone who calls him the son of the devil. You know who I'm referencing?
I'd have to go back and look.
It's not Irenaeus. So I might have misspoke. But there is a church father that specifically references him as a heretic, as a mutilator of Luke's gospel, and that calls him the son of the devil.
Yeah.
So
and then the Arian Christianity didn't start till about 318, so it was well outside the purview of Marcion. But
yeah, the ones that would have been expected. Let me pull this really quick.
Hi, Cyber.
Also, remember we have questions.
Yeah.
I was curious when Paul written some of the Gospels, apparently. What made you think Paul didn't exist?
What makes me think that Paul didn't exist?
Because I used to be a Christian a long time ago, but I'm an atheist now. But majority of the Gospels in the Bible didn't seem like it was correct. But I don't know who would have written that, Paul or the other one, Moses. Because apparently Moses written the first few scriptures in the process. So how do you know that the people that wrote the Bible wasn't Paul or Moses?
So why I would grant that, why I would say that Moses didn't exist is we've got no archaeological evidence of the Exodus or any archaeological evidence that he actually existed. In fact, if we're being gracious, we could grant the writing of the Torah to after the Babylonian exile, if we're being gracious. There is some evidence that was probably written quite a bit afterwards. But as far as Paul, it seems to be that, again, when we look at Paul and we compare Paul to Josephus, it seems like a lot of the shipwrecks and the ships and the trips that Paul was on, Josephus should have been on as well. Josephus writes things that are very comparative to events that Paul writes about. And also when we use stilometry to look at the epistles, it seems that the pastorals were probably written by Polycarp. They align up with Polycarp with the epistles. Again, the epistles seem to have been written by a few different people per each of them. And there's maybe one individual who, if there was like a Paul or a singular person that was like with them, they were only present for like 6 of them, and it was only a small portion of them. So given that Josephus never mentions Paul, we have no historians outside of Christianity that mention Paul, but yet he's going all over the place. We have no letters, nothing back to Paul. We've got no, and again, the stilometry seems to point that the epistles are written by multiple people. It just gives credence and evidence to me that Paul never existed, probably never existed.
I do want to remind the audience really quick. We have the poll up. It's the blue clipboard on the left side of your screen. Just hit that to vote on who you think won. Go ahead.
So to the Arianist comment, so the heresies that would have been expected to be challenged in like Irenaeus and Luke and Acts would have been Montanism and Valentinianism. Mm-hmm. So these are both positions and heresies that were unchallenged until later on in the 2nd century.
Yeah.
Okay. And with that, we can move on to the next question that we might have. Let me check the guest invitation. I've got Carrie.
Hi. I
Hello.
just wanted to make a comment and say that this is what debates should be. You both did excellent, and the level of professionalism was outstanding. And
This was a very different debate than I thought it was going to be. Like when I first challenged you, 100%. I'm very, very pleased with how this went.
It went very well. I think every future interlocutor should watch this debate and take notes on how to actually debate. Good job.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye, Cyber.
Bye, Carrie. Send my dad home.
I will.
Okay. And the next person, no degree, you can go.
Thank you. I'd like to say, BoughtByBlood, I was very impressed. You definitely prepared. But I did have a question for Cyber.
I haven't seen my family in 2 weeks.
Oh, okay. Well, I could tell you spent a lot of time on it. Cyber Deconstruction, you had said something about Luke in the 2nd century trying to correct some things from Paul, and I'm assuming the 1st century. Is that what you're saying?
So what I'm saying is that Acts. So we have in the epistles, we have where Paul is very focused on the Gentiles, right? Paul is trying to separate from the Jewish law, right? And we have, in there we get some issues. However, when we go and read Acts, it departs from that, where it seems like Luke is trying to be more friendly towards the Jewish people in Acts. So that's what I was referring to.
My question then is, since it's the case in Paul's epistles, he mentions Luke by name about 3 times. Mm-hmm. Do you think that what is going on in those epistles when he calls Luke the beloved physician at one point and says something, only Luke is here with me, in another one? What do you think is going on there? If Luke is trying to correct something in the 2nd century, who is the Luke Paul's talking about in his epistles?
So what my official standing is with the epistles of Paul is that the epistles of Paul were written by the Marcionites, not necessarily by Marcion, but by his school, and that when the church gets a hold of these writings, they actually edit them. In fact, oh crap, his name's fleeing my mind right now. But one of the church fathers, writes that he would have to take the letters of Paul on faith, except he had his own edited version of them. Trying to remember which church father that was. Tertullian, there we go, Tertullian. Tertullian states that he has to take Paul on faith, that he wouldn't believe it, except he has his own edited versions of it. And so, yeah, I just believe that the letters of Paul, once the church got a hold of them, or from Marcion, they did some heavy editing in them.
Okay. And with that, let's try to get Daniel's question in. Go ahead, Daniel.
Hey, hello. That was so much fun to listen to, honestly. Both of you were really, really well prepared, super articulate. Loved it, honestly. I did want to hear, John, I just wanted to hear how you would respond to what Cyber just said about his reasons for not thinking that Paul necessarily existed. And I also, just on top of that, I'll jump right back down. I'd love to actually see you guys in an extended conversation sometime. I think that would be really, really good fun.
You heard it. Debates on Daniel's live tonight. I'm kidding. I'm kidding.
I'm gonna play a video game or something. I'll see my family tomorrow. So the Tertullian point, is that what you're asking?
Or just any response at all to everything that Cyber just said like a minute ago, giving his reasons as to not necessarily being convinced Paul even existed.
Yeah, so I wasn't listening super intently because it wasn't my question, but I did hear a couple of things. Could you summarize for me?
Yeah, I can summarize it real quick.
Give a summary and then I can respond to it.
Yeah, so it seems to be that the letters of Paul came from the Marcionite school. His writing, the Apostolicon, is where we get the first rendition of the letters of Paul. And it seems to be that once the church got a hold of them, and they're trying to correct this Marcionite train of thought, they heavily edited the letters of Paul. And again, when we look at stylometry, it seems like the pastorals were written by Polycarp. It seems that if there was a Paul, he was only involved in like 6 of the letters, in very small portions of them. The stylometry shows that there's many authors to some of these texts. And it seems to be that the early church got them and edited them. And again, Tertullian mentioned that he would not believe Paul. He has to take Paul on complete faith, except for he has his own edited copies of them.
Okay, so I'm not familiar with the edited copy thing. That might just be something I have to look into. I'm not going to respond out my butt on something I haven't studied. So that would be the first thing. The reference to stylometry is just going to be this. There are many stylometric analysis of the New Testament. Almost all of them place everything in regards to a consensus. Almost all of them place everything within the first century regarding Paul's epistles, regarding even the Gospels. So the stylometric analysis isn't convincing to me on any notion. Like I even had a note in my thing. In the past 10 years, there have been over 25 peer-reviewed studies on stylometry regarding the New Testament, and all of them, and these are from actual academics and scholars, like he said, Jaron, who wrote the book Christ Before Jesus, is not one. He does not claim to be one, and that's perfectly fine. I think it is the case that what we need to evaluate is the work of experts, and not believe the experts simply because of the experts, but believe the experts based off of the justifications they provide over someone who's not an expert that would be considered in this academic field as an amateur and take those stylometric analyses and apply them to Paul's letters, and the fact that there is a consensus. Like I said, there's in the past 10 years, 25 plus stylometric analysis of the New Testament that have been peer-reviewed studies have been evaluated, coming to drastically different conclusions than Christ before Jesus. So,
Well,
Okay, let's try to get a sir in and then one more guest. Sir, you got anything for us? Or are you just here for your debate that's coming up next?
Than wants me to ask a question about stylo, but I don't have the stuff in front of me, so it has to do with the Eater's Delta distance. And I think what he wants me to ask Cyber is why it's not included in Jaren's book. I'm not even sure if Cyber would have an answer to that, but
it is. Hold on. It is included in his book.
I think he means specifically on the dendrograms. Like at the bottom, it's not included. I think that's what he's asking.
I read the whole book. I didn't see the engrams either.
Well, they have them. Well, that's what these are here, these charts, and they do put them in. They put them in at the bottom. So I guess I don't know what he's asking.
Those are distance.
I think he's asking about the dendrograms, but I don't know why he just doesn't bring his goofy self up here and ask you himself. I don't know.
I think he's with his kids. I think that's why.
Oh, okay.
He does have the dendrograms in them. Like, we do have them.
Yeah, but I think what he's asking is why don't the dendrograms include the render's distance? I think that's what he's asking.
Oh, that I wouldn't know. That'd be a question for CBJ himself. That I don't know right off the top of my head.
Dan always says to make sure to go to the Amazon page and look at the reviews of the book, because there's long reviews that are done by scholars to show why the book is extremely false and does not actually show its work.
Well, so the issues with those, and kind of into what Bought by Blood was talking about. So Stylo, the company that is peer-reviewed that Jaren uses, back in about 2018, so it used to be you had to do runs like at a book level. You'd have to run like an entire book because of the word count that was required. But due to breakthroughs in stylometry, they can now break it down to the chapter level. And one thing that Jaren will say is like one book they couldn't run was Philemon, because it doesn't have the word count. So they couldn't run Philemon, right? He'll say that. He has no problem saying that. And so when you take a look at that long book review that guy needs to get authored, needs to go get that published, if you go read that and you read it, his sources all date to 2012 or sooner. He doesn't have any updated sources, and he hasn't kept up on the updates and the breakthroughs that have happened within stylometry, right? And so how stylometry works, as a sense, is it looks at the basic words that we use, the common words. And so it's peer-reviewed. It's used in court. For example, if I was to hack into John's email account and I was to write a letter to his church, completely speaking blasphemy, they could go use Stylo and compare any of John's other emails to the email that I wrote, because the common words that we use are like fingerprints. And I would be able, or John would be able to save himself, because if he ran his work against the letter that I wrote, even though they don't know it was me, it would pop up as not John. So John would be saved.
So yeah, I'm gonna head up, but like even in those reviews, the statistician that reviewed it just showed that their method is completely invalid. And it doesn't mean that he's not updated on the data, it just means that their method is just invalid. But no, I just wanted to say both of you guys, and I'll head out. It's pronounced interlocutor. Interlocutor. Okay?
What are you talking about?
You said interlocutor.
I didn't say Twitter.
Yes, you did. You said interlocutor, and I have it on. Show me the. Yo.
Oh, I might.
Coco, send me the recording. Send me the recording.
Go ahead and send it to me.
Interlocutor
I'm fine.
is not how you pronounce
Listen,
it.
if I'm saying
John-
something wrong, that's fine.
John
I just
hasn't
want to say,
love you.
you
I
said
love
there.
you, John.
So,
John
Cyber,
hasn't
you said,
slept in like 3 weeks, so just give him a break.
yeah.
I love you.
Yeah, I've used the term interlocutor plenty of times, but yeah,
Look
if I
at
said
this
it,
guy. It looks like he just got off the show Survivor. Just look at
Yeah.
him.
You look like you're an illegal immigrant, bro. You got to get to bed.
So I wanted to ask this, Cyber, and then I'm willing to drop unless there's more questions. You said it's up for 6 peer reviews right now, right?
Correct.
If the findings of these 6 peer reviews turn out to be invalidating their research, will you stop defending their research or continue to?
I will need to wait till that comes out and take a look and see why. Is it because as you know, when they do peer reviews, they take a look. Was there a step that they missed? Then I probably wouldn't. It'd be like, hey, redo this, and then we'll see. If it was to come back and be like, yeah, this is complete. Like I don't even know why they did this. I don't know. But I
have a lot of other questions, but I'll do that in like your own live stream.
I'm actually curious about something. I don't know, Cyber, if you know. Do you know any of the journals? Like, if I named one of the journals, would you tell me if it's being sent to that journal? I'm just curious about one specific.
I have not asked those questions, so I don't know.
But also, guys, we do need to get to the next debate for Joe Sings, and like it's time to debate. But
it's time. Okay, well, Cyber, thank you. Coco, thank you for hosting. And Coco, there are people from my church that want to see the debate. If you could upload this to YouTube and then let me know, that would be great.
Okay, I can do that.
Okay, I'll let you. Cyber
host.
Conversation. You have a good night.
When is my debate supposed to be coming on?
I think
I'm supposed to be having a debate sometime in June or something. I just don't remember what day or what month. It's supposed to be sometime in June.
Did I find you an opponent for that debate?
I don't know. I remember I was supposed to have had somebody. No, I don't think you did actually. There's a guy who was supposed to have done that, never actually wanted to do it. So.
What proposition was it? I can try to set it up. I do have something planned.
Well, you could do like God. You could do God versus science. I mean, you have a religious belief, while I do my science stuff, and we see what's debate versus science.
Okay, I think I'll come up with a proposition and try to find you an opponent, and I'll let you know.
Coco, wait. Coco, I'm going to reboot my internet real quick. Sorry.
You're good.
Give me like 3 minutes. I'll be right back.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll come up with the proposition and find you a opponent. And yeah, I have one more event on June 13th. And then I'm waiting to see what Trump is going to do about the deadline for TikTok in America. And then, I'll keep hosting events. And
you'll probably keep getting extended.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully it does.
We have no update of like how close we are to the sale of this. Like, shouldn't there be like things out there, talks? Like, is there any article? I haven't been searching, to be fair, but
I'm not sure if they're getting closer to a sale. There have been rumors that like Mark Zuckerberg might like try to buy it, but that's like wild rumors.
Mr. Beast, is his group still doing it, or I don't know.
I'm not even sure. Mr. Beast is sort of hinting at buying it, but like I'm not sure.
That's been a long time. That's been like 6 months now.
Yeah,
half a year. And there's some other group I heard, but I don't know. So
all right, we have to get to the next debate now. Wait, hold on.
My opponent's gone. He's trying to come back.
Oh, true. Yeah,
we're waiting for Sir.
Going to be back in 3 minutes.
Yeah, I had the timer going. I mean, I have the timer not going, but I have the timer.
So are we doing video? Like, do we have to be on video here on our faces, or what's going on?
Oh no, you don't have to.
No, you don't have to.
I'll wait till Sir comes in. Whatever he decides, because I don't want to have like an unfair advantage. Like people can see me and not see him, or not. Whatever he thinks, I'll.
I mean, it doesn't. I don't think it sways the votes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello. Can we focus? Well, we have to wait till.
Did we have the results,
Coco?
Yes, I do have the results. But I might DM the contestants to see if they want me to release it or if they're okay with me releasing it.
I'm sure they're okay. Like I think that's the point of the.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, there's a vote.
I
Yeah,
usually don't vote if I'm.
we usually do. Yeah, we usually do votes for these things.
Okay, and this is typically mostly an atheist like live, right? So we can
Yeah.
be
So
under the opinion that there's probably gonna be more atheists in here.
yeah, so like
Yeah. Okay,
yeah,
so there was a time though where even regardless of them being atheists, I've seen voters
Atheists are
vote.
Christian.
I've seen voters vote for Christians, and Christians actually won by majority vote on this live. So
yeah, so there is a blog site that I also write regarding like this project of like hosting debates and tracking my journey to like figure out what I believe in. And I do write that the polls are not a
They're not fair.
completely honest dictator of who won, because yes, there can be more atheists in here. And I've been looking at the data and the polls that I've done for like the last like 8 events that I've hosted, and typically the atheist tends to win the debate by audience vote, but there have been a couple times where like the Christian did so well in comparison to their atheist opponent that the audience just ended up voting for the Christian.
Oh, that's true. I
Yes,
was figuring it's probably based a lot too on who has the bigger following, like because that's because people will see who's live and they'll try to join, like that's going to be a huge factor as well. Like it's whoever has the biggest following. If somebody has a big following, all their obviously followers are going to vote for the person. They
yeah,
like.
yeah. Coco, we could talk about some of the things that I believe could be good rubrics for judging, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah,
Can you guys hear me okay? Am I
Switch
lagging?
back up. Switch back
When
up.
This is actual profile.
When No Degree was uphill, he said that people didn't read the Bible. When I used to read the Bible, and I know what the Bible says, and I still had questions for him, but I never got the questions that I wanted.
Well,
maybe that's for this debate, right?
Yeah, let's talk about this later.
Let's talk about this
we could talk about that later right now.
Yeah, it wasn't this
We're
debate.
we're 8 minutes behind schedule, so let's try to get this going.